I found the listing on a state employment board at 2 in the morning, sitting in a motel room in Tacoma with a styrofoam cup of gas station coffee and $43 in my checking account. Winter maintenance caretaker, Harrow Point Ferry Dock, San Juan Islands chain. Seasonal posting, November through February. Housing provided on site. Stipend paid monthly. No prior maritime experience required. Contact the Regional Ferry Authority for application packet. I applied at 2:17 a.m. I was hired by 9 a.m. the next morning. I told myself this was because I was qualified. I know now it's because they needed the position filled before the previous caretaker left, and the previous caretaker was leaving whether they'd found a replacement or not. My name is Owen Marsh. I'm 28 years old. 8 months before I took the Harrow Point posting, my wife handed me a manila envelope across a kitchen table we'd bought together at an estate sale in Puyallup, and I signed everything inside it without reading it, because reading it would have made it more real than I could tolerate at the time. By October, I had a storage unit, a 2009 pickup, and a debt load that made full-time employment not a preference but a biological necessity. The ferry dock job paid enough to cover the storage unit, the truck insurance, and the minimum payments on 3 credit cards with room left over for groceries if I was careful. I drove up on a gray Tuesday morning in the first week of November with a duffel bag and a box of books I'd been meaning to read for 3 years, and I told myself the isolation would be good for me. I told myself a lot of things that month that turned out to be either wrong or dangerously incomplete. Harrow Point sits at the end of a single-lane road that cuts through old-growth Douglas fir for 11 miles before the trees simply stop and the dock appears. A gray wooden structure extending into a channel of water so dark it looks like poured iron on overcast days. The channel is called the Narrows. Local fishermen have a name for it. The Washington State Ferry Authority has a navigational designation for it. What they don't have is a route that runs through it anymore. Not in winter, not since the passenger numbers dropped below operational threshold sometime in the late 90s, and the seasonal service was reduced to a single maintenance posting, 1 caretaker, 1 vessel, 4 months of keeping everything functional and waiting for the spring schedule to resume. The vessel was called the Constance. She was a 40-passenger diesel ferry, well-maintained, blue and white, tied at the main dock with her engines cold and her windows dark when I pulled into the lot. She looked solid and purposeful and completely ordinary, and I remember thinking she was the first thing I'd seen in weeks that looked like it knew what it was for. The outgoing caretaker was waiting at the dock gate. His name was Stura. He told me his last name later, or I found it later, I'll get to that. And he was compact and weathered and already wearing his jacket zipped to the collar when I got out of the truck, like a man who had been ready to leave for some time and was simply waiting for the paperwork of my arrival to clear. He had a duffel bag. His truck was running. The handoff took 11 minutes. He walked me through the generator schedule, the radio check-in protocol, the diesel supply situation, the Constance's mechanical particulars. He spoke quickly and precisely and did not make eye contact during any of it. Not once. He looked at the dock, at the water, at his own hands. He did not look at me. At the very end, before getting into his truck, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a laminated sheet of paper. It was worn at the edges in the specific way of something handled daily, carried everywhere, consulted often, touched the way you touch something you need to believe is still there. He held it out to me and said, "These art from the Ferry Authority. Read them before tonight, all of them." And then he got into his truck and drove away up the single-lane road through the Douglas fir, and he did not look in the rearview mirror. I watched the truck until the trees swallowed it. Then I looked down at the laminated sheet. I read it standing on the dock in 38-degree air with the Narrows flat and black in front of me, and the fog just beginning to collect at the tree line on the far shore. The rules were formatted like official instructions, clean type, numbered, institutional. The kind of document that signals legitimacy through its appearance. The kind you read and instinctively trust because it looks like it came from someone with authority and process behind them. It was only when I started absorbing the content that the formatting began to feel less like competence and more like camouflage. Rule 1. Secure the Constance bow and stern every night before full dark, not at dark, before it. Rule 2. Log every sound from the water between midnight and 4 a.m. Do not respond to sounds that use your name. Acknowledgement is interpreted as an invitation. Rule 3. The manifest ledger must remain on the counter. It may not be moved, stored, or closed. The ledger is always open. Rule 4. If the Constance's engine starts on its own, do not board the vessel. Stand at the dock gate and wait. This has happened before. It will resolve. Rule 5 began. You will hear passengers on the far shore after midnight. They will ask to be picked up. Under no circumstances run the crossing after dark. The Constance has a maximum capacity of, and then nothing. A thick bar of black marker applied with pressure, pressed hard into the laminate until the surface was slightly buckled from the effort. Someone had not just obscured the text, they had wanted to be certain it stayed obscured. Whatever the Constance's capacity had to do with the crossing after dark was information I was not supposed to have. Rule 6. The foghorn activates automatically. Do not silence it. The foghorn is not for boats. Rule 7. On the last day of each month, leave a full thermos of coffee at the end of the dock before sunrise. This is not explained here. Leave it. Rule 8 began with something about the manifest ledger's open entries, something about not contacting the ferry authority, something about not researching names, and then the page simply ended, not with a margin, with a clean tear, straight across, as if the bottom third of the page had been removed deliberately. In advance, before the card was laminated, the tear was too clean for accident. Someone had prepared the document with that section already gone. The information that had been there was not missing. It had been managed. I stood with the sheet in my hands and looked up at the Narrows, and from somewhere across the water, distant, directionally wrong, swallowed almost entirely by wind and the particular thickness of the air over that channel, I heard a voice. I couldn't make out words. The sound had the shape of a human voice without the content of one. I told myself it was a bird. I was already practicing the discipline of explaining things away, and I didn't even know yet that I was doing it. I went inside to log my arrival in the manifest ledger. The ledger was exactly where Rule 3 said it would be, bolted to the ticket counter, open, a large cloth-bound book with entries going back to 1949 in half a dozen different handwriting styles. I found the current page. The most recent entry was 2 days old. I read it once, and then I read it again, and then I stood very still for a moment before I wrote my own name below it. The entry was in a handwriting I didn't recognize yet. A crossing, logged 2 days before my arrival. Passenger name, S.L. Lindquist. The return column. A box at the far right of each entry that was checked for most passengers, a simple confirmation of round-trip completion, was empty, blank, no notation, no explanation. I looked at the name again, Storer Lindquist, who had just driven away through the Douglas fir without looking in his rearview mirror, who had handed me a laminated card with rules he hadn't written and information strategically removed from it, who had crossed on the Constance 2 days before leaving and had not confirmed his return. I wrote my name in the ledger. I wrote the date. I wrote the time. I checked my own arrival box carefully, completely, making the mark as clear as I could. Then I looked out through the ticket booth window at the Narrows, at the water that was already losing the light, and I went to secure the Constance. Before full dark. Not at dark. The rule had a reason. I didn't know the reason yet. I followed it anyway. I spent my first full day learning the physical space of the posting the way you learn a new apartment, methodically, room by room, drawer by drawer, until the unfamiliar becomes at least mappable, if not comfortable. The dock building was a single structure, ticket counter and radio equipment in the front room, a break room behind it with a cot and a hot plate, and a coffee maker that worked if you held the carafe at a slight angle during brewing, a bathroom, a narrow storage closet that smelled of diesel and old rope. The Constance I'd already partially inventoried during Store's 11-minute handoff, and I spent another hour with her that morning. Engine room, passenger cabin, wheelhouse, controls. She was straightforward, a good vessel. I had her figured out by noon. The manifest ledger was a different kind of study. I couldn't leave it alone. I don't know exactly when I started reading it as something other than administrative record. Somewhere around entry 400, maybe, when I noticed a pattern in the return column. Most boxes were checked, a simple diagonal mark in faded ink, confirming the round trip. But some were empty, not blank from oversight, blank from conclusion. The ink around them the same age as the entry itself, meaning whoever had made the crossing had returned an empty box and nobody had ever come back to fill it. I started pulling back to look at the distribution. Winter entries overwhelmingly, crossings made after the seasonal service ended, times clustering in the midnight to 4 a.m. window, the same window. Rule 2 named, the same window I was required to document. I counted carefully this time. 61 open return columns, not 47 as I'd estimated the night before. 61 passengers who had crossed the Narrows and not confirmed their return, going back to 1949, clustered in winters, clustered in the dead hours. I wrote the number in my personal notepad and looked at it for a while. Then, somewhere in the middle of the ledger, between entries from what the handwriting suggested was the late 1960s, my fingers found a folded piece of paper tucked between the pages. Not inserted carelessly, placed, protected by the ledger's own binding, preserved in the dry interior of the closed sections. I unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was older, formal, the kind of deliberate cursive that people of a certain generation used for correspondence they intended to last, unhurried, every letter formed with patience. The note read, "For whoever finds this, the open entries are not missing data, they are accurate. Those passengers arrived at the far shore. The ledger cannot record what happens after that because the manifest only tracks crossings, not destinations. The far shore is not on any Washington State ferry route. It is not on any map I have found. I operated this crossing for 9 winters. I am writing this note in my 9th because I can hear my wife's voice from the water and she has been dead for 6 years, and I am not certain I will be able to follow Rule 5 much longer. Her voice knows exactly what to say. C. Haverford, Winter Caretaker, 1971-1980. I read it twice. The second time slowly. I noted the precision of what Haverford had written. Not I hear a voice that sounds like my wife, but her voice knows exactly what to say. The distinction between mimicry and knowledge, something that didn't just replicate sound, but understood the specific words that would undo a specific person. 9 winters of discipline, and what broke it wasn't volume or persistence, but accuracy. The right words, delivered correctly. I found C. Haverford in the ledger. January 19th, 1980. The return column was open. I found the entry directly after his. A new caretaker, February 1980, logging their first arrival. The cycle unbroken, the dock never closed. Someone had always come after, and none of them had known why the position was available. And the position was always available because the previous caretaker had either left or crossed, and either way the slot opened again and the ferry authority filled it, and someone new arrived with a duffel bag and a box of things they'd been meaning to get to. The posting had been cycling like this since before I was born. I was somewhere in the middle of a sequence that had been running for 75 years. That night, sitting at the counter with Haverford's note smoothed flat beside the ledger, I understood something that I didn't yet have words for, but that my body registered as a specific kind of cold, the cold of realizing that a thing you thought was incidental is actually structural, that you are not a person who took a job, that you are a position that has been filled. I secured the constants at 4:17 p.m., 43 minutes before full dark. I came back inside and sat at the counter with my notebook. I wrote down the number 61 again. I drew a box next to it. I left the box empty. The first night I followed the protocols with the careful, slightly self-conscious precision of someone who isn't yet sure if they believe what they're doing matters. I secured the constants. I set out a thermos even though it wasn't the last of the month because something in Rule 7's phrasing, the flatness of leave it, suggested that the timing was less important than the habit. I sat in the break room at midnight with a fresh notebook open to a clean page and a pen that worked. I wrote the date and the time in the heading, waterlog, midnight, 4 a.m. I sat and I listened. The Narrows have a sound at night that isn't quite silence and isn't quite movement. The water breathes. There is no other word for it. A slow pressure and release against the dock pilings, a rhythmic compression of air in the spaces between the structure's old timber, a sound that could be the building settling or could be something else entirely, depending on what frame of mind you brought to the listening. I'd lived near water before, in an apartment in Tacoma with a partial view of the sound from the bathroom window. If you stood on the edge of the tub, and I knew how to categorize water sounds, these were different in a way I couldn't immediately quantify. They were too patient, too consistent. Like breathing with purpose. 12:14 a.m. Low current sound, normal or consistent with normal. 12:31 a.m. The foghorn activated. I looked at Rule 6. Do not silence it. The foghorn is not for boats. I let it run. It sounded for 47 seconds and then stopped. I wrote down the duration. 12:58 a.m. Something against the hull of the Constance. Not rhythmic enough to be wave action, not sharp enough to be debris. I wrote it down. I did not go outside. At 1:33 a.m. I heard the voice. It came from the wrong direction. That's what I noticed first. Before the content, before the tone, before anything else, the directional wrongness of it registered. The voice was coming from the seaward end of the dock, from inside the dock's physical structure, from the darkness beyond the ticket booth window, not from across the water, not from the far shore, from the near end of the dock, as if someone was standing at the very edge where the wood meets the channel, close enough that they could have reached out and touched the Constance's bow. A man's voice, middle-aged, slightly hoarse, the voice of a tired person who has been traveling too long and has encountered an inconvenience that is annoying but not alarming because he still believes this is a situation with a normal resolution. He said, "Hello, is anyone? I need to get across. I missed the last crossing. Please." I gripped the edge of the counter. I did not speak. I did not move toward the window. The voice continued, patient, slightly confused, completely, terrifyingly reasonable. "I can see the light in the booth. I know someone's there. I just need a one-way ticket. I have cash." The cash detail was extraordinary. It was the specific detail of someone making their request legible, reducing the interaction to its simplest transactional elements. One-way ticket. Cash. It wasn't asking for anything unusual. A ferry dock caretaker, approached by a person who needed to cross, would have no rational reason to refuse. The rules were not rational. They were covenantal. I held them, and I did not speak. I wrote down everything he said, word for word. The time, the direction, the exact phrasing. My hand was steady. I remember being surprised by how steady my hand was. I think my body had decided that documentation was action, that holding the pen and moving it was doing something, and doing something was better than acknowledging how completely unequipped I was for whatever was happening outside the window in the dark. At 1:17 a.m. the voice stopped. At 1:19 a.m. I heard it again, further now, out over the water, moving away, growing smaller with distance. And this time it wasn't speaking to me. The voice said, at a conversational volume that carried perfectly across the flat, dark narrows, "He won't answer. He's following the rules. Not to me. About me. Reporting." I sat very still for a very long time. Then I opened the manifest ledger and searched for the physical description column, which I hadn't noticed before. A narrow column between the passenger name and the departure time, used inconsistently, filled in by some caretakers and left blank by others. I searched for middle-aged man, hoarse voice around 1 a.m. I found an entry from 2003. Gerald Foss, crossing logged at 1008 a.m. Physical description, male, 50s, gray jacket, hoarse voice. Return column, open. I had not described what I heard to anyone. I had not noted the gray jacket. I hadn't been able to see anything through the dark. But the ledger had the description. From 20 years before this night. I looked at it for a long time, and I wrote in my log, 1018 a.m. Voice moved off across water. Reported compliance to unknown recipient. Entity aware of rules. Entity testing adherence. Then I put the pen down and I watched the door until 4 a.m., when whatever window the rules described had closed, and I could no longer hear anything from the water except the patient breathing dark. By the third night, I had developed what I was starting to think of as professional discipline. I don't mean I wasn't afraid. I mean I had found a way to hold the fear at a functional distance through procedure. Log at midnight. Document sounds. Check rule card. Verify constants. The ritual of the protocols had a quality I recognized from the worst months of my marriage, the period when the distance between my wife and me had become so structural that the only way I could function in the apartment we still shared was to give myself small tasks, small completable things, because completion was the only form of control available. The doc gave me the same grammar. Do this, then this, then this, then document. Move to the next item. The shape appeared at 2:30 a.m. on the third night. No sound preceded it, no movement I caught. I looked up from my log because the quality of the dark outside the ticket booth window had changed in a way I felt before I saw a density, a presence, the way a room changes when someone has entered it even before they've made a sound. The shape was standing at the window, close, close enough that if there had been breath fog would have clouded the glass. The glass was clear. It was human in the way a sketch is human, the right dimensions, the right general architecture, the silhouette of a person wearing what looked like a rain slicker, standing still with the particular stillness of something that has decided to wait rather than act. Average height, hands at its sides, or possibly not. I couldn't resolve the lower portion clearly in the yellow halogen dock lighting. And the face, I moved to my left to get a better angle on the face. The shadow over the face moved with me. I moved to my right. The shadow adjusted. I stood up and leaned forward and changed my height and my angle simultaneously. The shadow was always there, always between the exterior light and whatever was beneath it, always maintaining the face as a zone of pure darkness regardless of geometry. It was not an accident of lighting. It was a feature. I picked up the radio. The static was total and immediate, not the textured static of interference, but the clean static of disconnection. I set the radio down. I looked at the shape. The shape looked back at me from behind its maintained shadow, from behind its breath-free glass, and it stood there with the patience of something that is never needed to hurry because it has never operated on a timeline that required it. At 3001 a.m., it was gone. Between one blink and the next, I checked the dock camera footage from the exterior camera, the one that covered the dock from the building face outward toward the Constance. I reviewed every frame from 229 to 302. The dock was empty in all of them. Halogen lights on the empty boards. Water beyond. No shape. No rain slicker. No shadow where no shadow should be. 33 minutes of presence recorded as 33 minutes of absence. I sat with this for a long time. Then I went back further, reviewed night one from the beginning, just to be systematic, to have done the thing fully. At 1:30 a.m. on night one, exactly the moment Gerald Foss's voice had appeared from the dock's seaward end, the exterior camera showed a figure standing at the dock's far edge. It was there in one frame and absent in every frame before and after it. I ran the timestamp, 1/30th of a second. A single frame, the figure had been present for exactly the minimum increment that a 30 frame per second camera could capture, which was also exactly below the threshold that triggered the camera's motion detection alert. It had not been careless, it had been calibrating. It had tested the camera on night one to learn its sensitivity threshold, and then on night three it had stood at the window for 31 minutes and left no record at all. Whatever I had seen, whatever had stood at my window and kept its face in shadow while I moved through every angle I could reach. It had already learned the difference between leaving evidence and not leaving evidence. It had made a choice. The choice told me that documentation, my one available instrument, was not going to be enough. I closed the camera playback. I sat at the counter with both hands flat on the wood, and I breathed through my nose until my heart rate settled into something I could work with. Then I opened my log and I wrote, very precisely, night 3, 2:33:01 a.m. Presence at window. Not recorded. Camera anomaly. Night 1 confirmed intentional. Entity has studied the documentation system. It is operating outside the documentation system deliberately. I looked at what I'd written. Then I added one more line. It is not afraid of me. It is managing me. The daily radio check-in was the most ordinary part of my day, and I had come to value it the way you value ordinary things when the rest of your life has stopped being ordinary. 60 seconds. Dock status, weather, vessel condition, caretaker welfare confirmation. The mainland operator was a woman named Deb. Warm, consistent, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who has been doing the same job with genuine investment for a long time and has found satisfaction in its repetition. She knew my name by day 3. She asked about the weather like she meant it. In the context of everything else happening at Harrow Point, Deb's voice at 8 a.m. was the most reliable proof I had that the ordinary world still existed and I was still connected to it. On day 9, Deb said something at the end of our check-in that stopped the ordinary world mid-sentence. She said, "Oh, before you go, we got your check-in from last night too, the 2 a.m. one, "Everything okay? You sounded a little off." I had not called in at 2 a.m. I had been in the break room following Rule 2, silent and documented in not touching the radio. I asked Deb to play it back. There was a pause while she pulled the recording, and in that pause I became aware of how precisely my body had started cataloging fear responses. The tightening across the top of my shoulders, the drop in peripheral vision, the specific way my hearing sharpened. All of it happening automatically now, my nervous system having been recalibrated over 9 days to treat every unexpected thing as a potential threat. The recording came through the radio. It was my voice, not close to my voice, not a voice with similar qualities. My voice, my exact cadence, the particular rhythm of my sentences, the slight roughness in my consonants that had developed from the cold, the habit I have of dropping the volume slightly at the end of a phrase before picking it up again. The recording said, "Checking in from Harrow Point. All clear. Dock secure. I'm going to run a quick crossing. Someone needs to get across. I'll be back in an hour." Deb said they'd tried to reach me after to confirm, but I hadn't responded, and they'd assumed I'd gone back to bed. I went to the dock. The Constance was secured bow and stern properly, exactly as I'd left her. Whatever my voice had announced into the radio, whatever entity had stood at the radio and produced me with enough fidelity to pass Deb's attention, it had not followed through on the crossing. It had placed the call and not acted. Rehearsal, groundwork, the construction of an institutional record that would read if something happened to me as caretaker announced unauthorized crossing. Caretaker became unresponsive. Caretaker's fate unclear. I went back through my own check-in recordings from day 1. I listened to all 9. On days 3, 5, and 8, at the very end of the call, before the line clicked off, there was a half-second of additional silence. Standard calls ended on the click. These 3 ended with a pause, a breath of space that I'd never noticed in real time because it was so brief. On days 3 and 5, the half-second was clean, just space. On day 8, under the static, barely audible unless you turned the volume up and pressed your ear to the speaker, my own voice, quiet, trying something out. Someone needs to get across, spoken softly, practiced. I sat on the dock in the cold, and I thought about what it meant that something had been listening to me for 8 days, with sufficient attention to produce a working replica, and that the replica's first use had been to pre-authorize a crossing I hadn't consented to take. I thought about the institutional logic of it, the way that a recorded radio call, filed with the mainland authority, created a paper trail that would explain my disappearance in mundane terms. Caretaker announced a crossing. Caretaker didn't come back. These things happen on remote water in winter. I thought about how carefully this had been arranged, and I felt, for the first time since arriving, something colder than fear, something closer to the recognition that I was not dealing with appetite. I was dealing with methodology. I called Deb back. I told her the 2 a.m. call was not from me and should be flagged as unauthorized. She was concerned. She asked if I needed assistance. I said no. I said I was following protocols. She said okay, she'd note it. I signed off. I sat at the counter with the radio between my hands, and I thought about what it will resolve meant in Rule 4, about the Constance starting on its own. I thought about whether the entity's plan had a resolution protocol of its own, and what resolution looked like from its side of the Narrows. That night at 3 a.m., the radio produced one more sound before I silenced it for the log window. A half-second. My voice. A new phrase being tried. "I'll be back in an hour." Softer than the last. More certain, like something settling into confidence. I woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of the foghorn, not the automated pulse of Rule 6, but a single sustained blast, manual, the kind produced by someone physically pulling the activation cord in the dock building's main room. I was out of the break room cot and through the door in seconds, barefoot on the cold floor, reaching for the light switch as I came through. The main room was empty. The foghorn cord was swinging, pendulum motion, still completing the arc of a pull made seconds ago. The rope moving through empty air above an empty floor. The room was empty. The dock, visible through the window, was empty. The Constance was secured. I stood in the middle of the room in the cold and listened to the foghorn cord settle into stillness. Then I went to the manifest ledger, because that was the rule. Document everything, especially the anomalous, especially the things that happened when nothing was supposed to be happening. I opened to the current page to note the time and the event. There was a new entry. I had not written a new entry. I had made my last entry the previous afternoon. The new entry was in my handwriting. The handwriting I've had since high school, with the slightly uneven baseline and the particular way I close the letter O and the habit I have of writing the date in the European format, day, month, year, which I picked up from an ex-girlfriend and never stopped. The entry read, Passenger Owen Marsh. Date, November 29th. Departure, 3:04 a.m. Destination, Far Shore. Return confirmed, blank. It was 3:07 a.m. on November 29th. The entry said I had departed 3 minutes ago. I was standing at the counter. I had not departed 3 minutes ago. I was standing at the counter. I was reading the record of a crossing that had not happened, or had not happened yet, or had this was the thought that my mind reached for and then recoiled from, had happened in whatever accounting system the ledger operated within. In the ledger's own logic of what constituted fact, the ledger recorded what was real to the ledger. The entry was not a prediction. It was a record. The difference between those two things was the difference between something that might be avoided and something already true. I tried to close the ledger. The bolt held. I tried to cross out my name. The pen moved across the page and left no mark, the ink refusing the surface, beating and running the way water runs on wax. I tried a different pen, a marker. I pressed until my hand ached and the page showed nothing but my entry, intact, indelible, my handwriting confirming my departure at 3:04 a.m. to a destination that was not on any map. I found Haverford's note again, and I read the line, the ledger cannot record what happens after that, because the manifest only tracks crossings, not destinations. The ledger tracked crossings. I had crossed, according to the ledger, at 3:04 a.m. I was standing at the counter at 3:07, which meant 3 minutes of my life had been accounted for by a system I didn't control, in a direction I hadn't chosen, and the record was immune to correction. I searched for Stewart's entry, the one with the open return column that I'd noticed on my first night. I found it. His name, his crossing, his empty confirmation box. And in the physical description column, which had been blank when I first read it, someone had now written, in ink that looked no newer or older than the surrounding entries, tall, Wyatt, took the job from a man named Owen, a description that only made sense after I arrived, a description that could only have been written with knowledge of events that occurred after Stewart's crossing date. The ledger had updated itself with information from my future, or from a future in which my departure was already history. I sat at the counter with my own entry in front of me, and I did the only thing left to do. I opened my notebook. I wrote the time. I wrote what I'd found. I wrote what I'd found. I wrote Haverford's line about destinations. I wrote, the ledger is not recording what happened. It is recording what it has decided to be true. I need to understand the difference between those things before 3:04 a.m. becomes 3:04 a.m. again. I looked at the entry one more time. My name, my departure, my open return column. Then I turned the page. I started a new section. I wrote at the top of the fresh page in capital letters, what Stursh left that he'd didn't tell me about. I took the storage closet apart shelf by shelf, not frantically, carefully, the way you search when you understand that what you're looking for might be small and might be hidden with intention, and might require you to look at the back of every surface rather than just the front. I moved the shelving unit, which was bolted to the back wall, but whose bolts had been loosened at some point by someone who had also needed to access the wall behind it. Behind the shelving unit, taped flat against the back wall with 4 strips of duct tape applied with careful overlap at the corners. A sheet of paper, unlaminated, older than the laminated cards Stewart had handed me. Thicker paper, slightly yellowed. The typeface older in that specific way of documents produced before desktop printing, the original, the version before the redactions. I peeled the tape carefully. I unfolded the sheet at the breakroom table. I read Rule 5 first. The full text of Rule 5 said, "You will hear passengers on the far shore after midnight. They will ask to be picked up. Under no circumstances run the crossing after dark. The Constance has a maximum passenger capacity of 40. The Entity has a maximum passenger capacity of 61. This number has not changed since 1949. When the 60-second passenger crosses to the far shore, the capacity is exceeded and the crossing closes permanently. The narrows seals, the dock dissolves into the channel, and all 62 passengers are released back across simultaneously. This is not rescue. We do not know what comes back. The current caretaker is the 60-second scheduled passenger. The caretaker is always the 60-second scheduled passenger. This is not coincidence. The caretaker position was created to complete the count. I stopped reading. I looked at the table's surface for a moment. I was aware of my breathing. I was aware of the sound of the water outside. I went back to the page. Rule 8 said, the manifest ledger's open entries are not errors. They are the entity's passengers, held at the far shore, preserved exactly as they were at the moment of crossing, waiting for the count to complete. If you begin to recognize the voices from the water as matching names in the ledger, you have been studied long enough to be considered compliant. The caretaker posting is not a job. It is the final passenger slot. The Washington State Ferry Authority does not know this. The position was inserted into their system in 1949 by a party whose name does not appear in any organizational record. Every caretaker who has held this post has been the 62nd. When one declines, when one holds the rules long enough and leaves, a new 62nd is found. The rules were written by the entity. The rules keep you here long enough to be logged. I read both rules again and again. I needed multiple passes because my mind kept flinching away from the central clause before I could complete it. The rules were written by the entity. Every protocol I had observed, every careful behavior, every logged sound, every 4 p.m. constant securing had been designed not to protect me from the crossing, but to protect the crossing from me leaving before it happened. Rule 2, which kept me inside and quiet and documented during the window of maximum vulnerability, was not survival instruction. It was a holding pattern. Rule 3, which kept me at the counter with the ledger always open, kept me proximate to my own scheduling. Rule 7, the thermos of coffee, the small ritual of offering, was tribute, yes, and also confirmation that I was present and functional and committed to a routine that kept me here. The rules were a cage built to look like a shelter. I counted the caretaker entries in the ledger. Every arrival since 1949. I counted the cycles. Each caretaker's arrival, their tenure, their departure either by voluntary exit or by open return column. I added the counts. The math was consistent. Every caretaker arrived as the 60-second slot. Every cycle, the entity had 61 held and 1 incoming. And yet the count had never been completed. Something, each time, had broken the system. Something had made the 60-second caretaker leave before the ledger entry could become permanent. I didn't know what that was, but the rules existed because, without them, something in each previous caretaker had finally moved toward the door. The rules were there to delay that movement until it no longer mattered. I folded the paper and I put it in my chest pocket against my sternum, and I felt it there while I sat very still. And I thought about the truck in the parking lot and the road through the Douglas fir and the 11 miles between me and a highway that connected to every other place in the world. I thought about those things clearly and practically and with full awareness of what they meant. Then I thought about why Stewart had left the original taped to the wall, why he'd known it was there, why he'd left it for me to find, because he had, I was certain of it, he'd loosened those bolts himself. He'd made the document findable by someone who looked carefully enough. He had given me the redacted version and hidden the full version in the same handoff. And I understood that this was not contradiction, it was sequence. He was giving me what I could hold at first and leaving me what I'd need when the first version wasn't enough. He had planned the handoff with the care of someone who knew exactly how this progressed, which meant he'd been here long enough to know, which meant the open return column next to his name in the ledger was not a record of a crossing he'd failed to survive. It was a record of a crossing he'd taken deliberately, with full information after hiding the document for me. Stewart had not been taken. Stewart had gone. And he had gone having arranged everything so that I would eventually understand why. By the following night, I was operating in a different register entirely. Not panic. Panic is a response to surprise, and I had run out of surprise. What I had instead was a kind of high-alert clarity. Every system in me pointed outward, cataloging, assessing, giving nothing in return. The entity had voice and form and radio capability and access to the ledger's logic. It had studied me for weeks. I assumed it would try something I hadn't seen before. I was right, but I hadn't correctly anticipated what new looked like. The small boat appeared from the direction of the far shore at 8:30 p.m., earlier than any previous contact, a different vector entirely, coming from the channel itself rather than the near dock or the radio. Running lights on, moving at a reasonable speed, slightly cautious, the way someone moves a small boat in unfamiliar water at night. An aluminum skiff. A person at the tiller wearing an orange life vest, one hand raised when they saw the dock lights. She tied up at the small craft slip with practiced efficiency. She said her name was Renata. She'd been stranded on one of the outer islands since afternoon. Motorboat trouble. She'd been trying to reach help for hours. She'd seen the dock lights. Could she please use the radio? She was in her mid-30s, with cold, reddened cheeks and the specific exhausted quality of someone who has been solving problems in the cold for too long. She sat at the break room table and wrapped both hands around the coffee I gave her and said it tasted incredible. I asked her where she'd come from. She named an island. I checked it. It existed, the right distance, the right direction. I asked what her boat's trouble was. She described it accurately, mechanically specific in the right ways. I asked who she'd been trying to reach. She named the Coast Guard station, described her attempts, was consistent. I asked her what the name of the dock we were at was. She said Harrow Point, which is not labeled on most maps, which you'd know only if you had been looking for it or had been told. She had everything right. She had the geography, the mechanics, the distress narrative, the correct name of an obscure dock. And then she laughed at something I said, some small, dry observation about the coffee maker requiring a specific angle, something genuinely minor, and the laugh stopped me mid-sentence and sat in my chest like a stone dropped in still water. I know that laugh. I have known it my whole life. The particular quality of it, the small catch at the start, the way it settled into warmth before it fully opened. It was my mother's laugh. My mother, who died when I was 19, who I have no recordings of, whose voice I carry only in memory. Renata had never met my mother. Renata could not have heard that laugh from any external source. It existed only in my memory, and in the 11 years my mother had spent producing it in rooms I was also in. The entity had been inside my memories. It had been collecting. I said I was going to check on the dock, and I went outside and stood in the cold until my face was numb and I had a clear enough head to think. The entity had not sent a monster. It had sent a puzzle, a person assembled from the parts of me most likely to fail. A stranger's face, attached to competence, attached to an explanation that checked out, attached to my mother's laugh. Each element independently might not have been enough. Together they were almost enough. I had almost said yes to all of it without examining any of it, because the laugh had the same weight it always had, and weight bypasses analysis. At 3 a.m. I checked the break room. The cot was cold and empty. I ran to the small craft slip. The skiff was gone. No running lights visible on the water, no sound of an engine. Simply absent. The radio showed an outgoing transmission at 2047 a.m. I pulled the recording. My voice. Calm, confident, completely mine. Confirm crossing scheduled for November 30th. Pre-dawn. Single passenger authorized. Manifest entry complete. I had not touched the radio. I had not authorized anything. But my voice had, and the mainland authority had the recording, and the ledger, when I went to check, had a new secondary notation beside my entry. A small mark, the kind of administrative confirmation a clerk might add, which had not been there before, and which in the ledger's logic meant something I didn't want it to mean. The entity wasn't trying to frighten me across. It was filing paperwork, making my departure institutional, documented, authorized through every channel available, so that when I crossed, and it was building a reality in which when was the appropriate word rather than if, the record would be complete from every angle. I thought about Haverford writing his note in his 9th winter, his wife's voice knowing exactly what to say. I thought about what Renata's laugh had done to my thinking for those 30 seconds before I caught it. I understood now how you lasted 9 winters and then didn't. Not because the entity got stronger, because it got more accurate. I went under the dock at low tide the following morning with a flashlight and the specific intention of understanding every physical surface of the place I was occupying. I had been documenting the supernatural aspects of Harrow Point for 2 weeks with careful precision, and I had not yet walked the full physical geometry of the structure itself, which felt like an oversight I could correct. I told myself this was systematic. I think the real reason is that I'd begun to feel that the dock was keeping secrets in its architecture, and I needed to know the shape of the space I was inside. The underside of the dock was standard. Pilings sunk deep, cross-bracing, barnacle-heavy timber, the particular cold that lives permanently in the shadow of structures over water. I worked my way from the building side end toward the narrows, flashlight on the cross-bracing, documenting nothing unusual until I reached the seaward end, the final section, the part of the dock that extended furthest into the channel. There, where the water was deepest at low tide and the pilings were oldest, my flashlight caught something that the surrounding structure was not. Worked stone, not the rough basalt of the island's natural formation, but shaped stone, fitted, deliberate. A chamber, built between the dock's support structure, predating the dock itself. The dock had been built over it, around it, incorporating it the way a building incorporates an existing foundation that was already there. Inside the chamber, carved into the stone, a ledge. In the ledge, carved recessions, each one individual, perfectly spaced, 61 of them in a row. And in each recession, an object. A watch with a cracked face. A child's shoe, leather preserved by the cold and the mineral quality of the stone. A wallet, the leather rotted but the initials still legible on the tarnished clasp. A wedding ring. A woman's compact mirror. A pen, a photograph too damaged to read. A house key on a ring with a faded tag. 61 objects, one per unconfirmed return, arranged with the care of a collection maintained over decades. Not trophies. The wrongness of trophy was immediately apparent. These were belongings. They were being kept, not displayed. They were being held in trust for people who had crossed, and were themselves being held, preserved at the moment of their crossing, waiting. The chamber beneath the dock and the far shore making 2 ends of the same system, object and person, separated at the moment of crossing and preserved in parallel until the count completed and whatever the full count unlocked became possible. At the end of the row of 61 recessions, one more, empty, stone smooth, sized with the same care as the others. I looked at it. I took the dock lantern from my belt, the lantern I'd been issued on day 1. The lantern store had handed me before anything else, specifically, before the generator schedule or the radio protocol, the first thing. I held it over the empty recession. It fit, not approximately, precisely, with the specific fit of something that had been sized for this object. The lantern had been issued to me not as a tool, but as a placeholder. It had been keeping the space. I turned the lantern over and shone the flashlight on its base. Scratched into the metal, tiny but deliberate. The marks of something sharp applied with patience. 61 tally marks in groups of 5, and then one more mark, partial, the first stroke of a new group, begun and not completed. The lantern had been counting my nights at Harrow Point from the first night, not by my hand, by something that had been tracking my tenure since before I arrived. I had been carrying my own reservation since day 1, and I'd not known it, and Storray had handed it to me first, specifically because he had known it too, and he had given it to me anyway, and the decision that represented was one I was only beginning to understand. I came back up into the gray November light, and I stood on the dock with the lantern in both hands, and I counted the tally marks again. 61 complete, 1 partial. I counted the nights I'd been at Harrow Point. I was not going to let myself complete that arithmetic. I put the lantern back on my belt and I went inside. I should have left that night. I want to be precise about this. I want to say it plainly so that it doesn't get softened by whatever came after. I had a truck in the lot. I had a road. I had a phone with charge enough for 1 call and enough fuel in the tank to reach the highway, and from the highway the world was accessible in every direction. The door to the dock building was unlocked. The gate at the lot entrance had no lock. There was nothing physical between me and departure except the choice to walk across the lot and open the truck door. I stood at the gate at 9 p.m. with my keys in my hand, and I looked at the narrows. The fog was gone. The water was calm, and in the cold November night it carried a faint phosphorescence, not dramatic, not bioluminescent bloom, just the particular faint luminescence that salt water sometimes produces in winter, a barely there glow that made the channel visible as a distinct thing rather than a piece of darkness with different qualities. The far shore was clear, a tree line dark against the sky, and in the trees a light, warm yellow interior, the specific quality of a light that comes from inside a building where the heat is on. It was too far to see detail. It was close enough to suggest warmth. My body produced a response to it that I can only describe as recognition, the physical sensation of something known appearing in an unexpected place, the feeling of turning a corner and seeing a landmark you didn't expect. I had no reason to feel recognized. I had never been to the far shore. I had no knowledge of any structure there. The warmth my body produced in response to that light was not memory. It was something the entity had been assembling over weeks, from the voices in the midnight log, from the accumulated hours of documentation, from Renata's laugh and Gerald Voss's hoarse patience, and whatever it had collected from my own voice in the half-seconds after my check-in calls. It had been building, from all of those parts, a specific frequency, the frequency of the thing I had been trying to find since my marriage ended, the shape of arrival, the feeling of finally being somewhere instead of perpetually in transit. I went back inside. I told myself it was because I needed to document the night's log. I opened the ledger. I read the 61 names slowly, all of them, top to bottom, letting each name take a moment. I had started, without fully noticing it happening, to associate the names with voices. Gerald Voss with the hoarse midnight request, Margaret Aurelio from 1987 with the soft measured cadence that had started on night 6, others with their own qualities that I had absorbed through weeks of careful documentation. I had learned them, not their faces or their lives, but their sound, the specific frequency each of them carried, and together they had a sound, a combined register, a chord made of individual notes, and the chord had a quality I recognized. In my personal notepad I wrote, "I keep thinking about what Haverford wrote. He said his wife's voice knew exactly what to say. I've been trying to figure out which voice knows what to say to me. I think it might be all of them. I think it's building something out of all of them. I think what it's building sounds like the place I've been trying to find since my marriage ended. I think that's the point." I read what I'd written. I didn't cross it out. I turned the page. I looked at my ledger entry. Owen Marsh, departure 3:04 a.m., return blank. I put my finger on the blank return column and I sat with it. 61 people had gone across and hadn't confirmed return, but they also hadn't dissolved. They were held, preserved at the moment of their crossing. Some of them had been there since 1949. I thought about impermanence, about the storage unit in Tacoma with my father's tools in it, about the apartment I'd sublet after the divorce, about the way that everything I'd built for the decade of my marriage had turned out to be temporary in ways I hadn't been warned about. I thought about the word held, and I noticed that it was not, in that moment, a word that felt like imprisonment. It felt like the opposite of loss. It felt like the thing loss was the absence of. I wrote one more line in the notepad and then I closed it. The line was, "I understand the mechanism." I don't know if that helps. Last day of November. I left the thermos at the end of the dock at 5:45 a.m. before sunrise, while the sky was still the particular dark blue that precedes light by 40 minutes. I stood and watched the dock end. At 5:49 a.m. the thermos was there. At 5:50 a.m. it was not. Between one blink and the next, simply absent. I felt no fear about this. What I felt was closer to the satisfaction of a completed gesture, the ritual acknowledgement of the system I was embedded in, the small functional pleasure of doing the thing correctly. This recognition of what I was feeling scared me more than fear had. When I went inside, there was a thermos on the break room table that did not belong to me. Old Army surplus green, dented at the seam, full, I could tell from the weight when I picked it up, with coffee that should have been cold given that nothing in the building had heated it. I poured a cup. I drank it before I made the decision to do so, my hands and my mouth completing the action while my analytical mind was still forming the sentence, "You shouldn't drink that." The coffee tasted like the diner in the town where I grew up, the one that had closed when I was 12, the one with the particular burnt-edge flavor of a carafe kept on too long that I had not tasted in 20 years, and would not have been able to describe if asked but recognized completely, viscerally, in the first sip. I finished the cup. I poured another. I finished that too. Then I went to the manifest ledger and I looked at my entry. I looked at it for a long time. I thought about what the return column actually meant, not administratively, but in the logic of the thing that had been running this system for 75 years. The open return columns for 61 passengers were not evidence of loss. They were evidence of completion. Those passengers had arrived. The ledger tracked crossings, and the crossing was complete when you reached the destination. The return column was blank because return was not the destination. Arrival was the destination. The column was not a record of failure. It was a record of a kind of finality that the ledger's own categories were insufficient to capture. I held my pen over my own blank column, and I did not fill it in, and I did not cross out my name. I walked out of the dock building and across the lot to my truck. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine off. The Narrows were perfectly still. No wind, no fog. The far shore visible in the gray morning light. The tree line clear. No light in the trees now, but the absence of the light feeling temporary rather than permanent. The way a light feels when someone has stepped away from the window, but will return. I sat for 19 minutes. I know it was 19 because I watched the dashboard clock. Then I got out of the truck. I walked back to the dock building. I sat at the counter with my hands flat on the wood, and I breathed. I took the laminated rule card from my pocket. I borrowed the dock building's good pen, the one with the fine point that Stuhr had left in the drawer labeled Radio Log. In careful handwriting below Rule 8, I wrote, Rule 9, the water sounds like home because it has learned every sound home ever made for you. This is not an accident. Knowing this does not help. I read the rule back. It was accurate. It was the most accurate sentence I had written at Harrow Point, which was a place I had been documenting with precision for a month. I put the pen down. I called Deb for the morning check-in. Dock secure, weather clear, vessel secured, caretaker confirmed present. She gave me the standard acknowledgement, and then she said, "Hey, got an applicant for your position for next winter. You planning to re-up, or should I process them?" I looked at the ledger. I said, "Go ahead and process them." I paused. Then, make sure they read the protocols before they arrive, all of them, before dark, first day. Deb said she'd pass it along. I signed off. I opened my notepad to a fresh page. I took the laminated card, and I began writing annotations, carefully, in the margins. Against each rule, the things I knew now that I hadn't known when Stuhr handed the card to me. Not warnings, exactly. Explanations. The difference between warning and explanation is that a warning tells you to go, and an explanation tells you what you are inside of. I was writing the latter because I had stopped believing the former was the point. February. A gray morning, the specific, colorless gray of the Pacific Northwest in deep winter, the kind of light that has no source and no shadow and makes everything look like it's being viewed through frosted glass. A truck pulled into the Harrow Point lot. She sat in it for a moment before getting out. I know because I was at the gate watching the way Stuhr had watched me, and I could see her looking at the dock, at the channel, at the far shore, the way everyone looks at it the first time, trying to understand the quality of the water, the compression of the space, the wrongness that is architectural rather than specific. Her name was Simone Beauchamp. She was in her mid-30s. She had taken the posting for the isolation and the stipend, which is what people say when they mean they need the money and the solitude, and they've run out of reasons to stay where they were. I recognized the situation completely. The handoff took 9 minutes. I covered the mechanical basics, the generator, the radio protocol. I did not make eye contact during any of it. I was aware of this, aware of myself doing the thing Stuhr had done, aware that the awareness didn't change the behavior, that some things became structural once you'd been inside them long enough. At the end, I took the laminated card from my jacket pocket and I held it out. She could see it had been re-laminated. New plastic applied over the original, the old card preserved inside, the annotations visible through the layers, the margins dense with notes. She looked at it and then at me, and I could see the specific quality of her attention. Sharp, careful, the attention of someone who has been through enough to know when a document is worth reading in full. I said, "These aren't from the Ferry Authority. Read them before dark. All of them. The annotations matter as much as the rules." I got in my truck. I did not look in the rearview mirror. Simone stood on the dock reading the card. The February air was sharp, the Narrows still, the far shore a dark tree line against a gray sky. She read through the rules in sequence. She reached Rule 2 and the annotation I had written against it. The long one, the careful one, the one I'd revised 3 times before I was satisfied with its accuracy. Rule 2 annotation. It will use the voice of someone you've lost. It will know exactly what that person would say to you, in exactly the right moment, with exactly the right cadence. This is not supernatural. It has had 75 years of practice, and it has learned from 61 people who loved others the way you love whoever you're already thinking of right now. I'm not telling you this to frighten you. I am telling you so that when it happens, you know you are not going crazy. You are being studied. The studying began before you arrived. It began when you took the job. She lowered the card. She looked at the Narrows for a long moment. From across the water, distant, compressed by the particular acoustics of that channel, swallowed by the February quiet, a voice she had not heard in 3 years, a voice that knew with a precision no external source could account for exactly what she needed it to say. She did not respond. Her hand went to her jacket pocket and came out with a notebook, spiral bound, already broken in at the spine, a pen clipped to the cover. She opened it. She wrote the time. She wrote what she'd heard. She wrote in a slightly different hand than the rest, as if she were copying from something. 1. Do not respond to sounds that use your name. She was already following the rules. She was already inside the system. The studying had already begun. Through the ticket booth window, visible from where she stood, the manifest ledger lay open on the counter. Rule 3. Always open, always present. The most recent entry was in a handwriting she didn't know yet. Owen Marsh, caretaker. Departure December 1st, 34 a.m. Destination, far shore. Return confirmed, blank. Below it, a single line in older ink. Truly old, the kind of old that means decades rather than years. The iron gall brown of ink applied before most living people were born. A line that had always been there, that every caretaker had read 100 times without seeing, that required the completed context of 75 years to understand. Caretaker position permanent. Cycle open. Count, 62 of 62. Crossing scheduled upon capacity confirmation. The count was complete. Whatever the entity had been holding 62 people in reserve to accomplish had been scheduled. Simone was not the next 62nd. She was the first person to arrive at Harrow Point after the count closed. The rules had been written for the period before completion. There were no rules for this. She didn't know that yet. The foghorn sounded. Automatic. Not for boats. Not for boats. On the far shore in the February trees, a light came on. Warm, yellow interior. The specific quality of a light in a window when the heat is on inside and someone is standing at the stove. Simone looked up from her notebook. The Narrows were perfectly still.